it seems that this rollback of de minimis as a concept is going to have pretty massive structural changes to cross-border e-commerce just in general. Um, Given your understanding of how customs usually announces things and then rolls them out, how quickly do you think this will happen, and when do you think this will start to happen, and how do you think it's going to come about?
So as you mentioned earlier, countries like Canada have quite limited de minimis shipments, and those have been progressively reduced over the past few years. So as de minimis exemptions start to vary, people will need to understand that they're expiring, because just because you ship something, if you're shipping something from China and it takes a month to arrive in the U.S. because it was on the ocean for a month, or maybe something got held because of weather, you have to plan for what the regulations are when the good will clear customs, not for when you ship them, and not from when you ordered them. So doing that kind of scenario planning is really, really key. Um, Another place that we're going to see a lot of variability is in the understanding of not only which regulations apply, but what duty rates might apply as those shipments kick in. As if you imagine an organization that's been doing drop shipping of large and expensively bought items, they've never had to have a customs compliance department in place to assess what those duties and fees are. So just doing that transition from somebody who relied on a de minimis exemption to no longer being able to benefit from that is a huge organizational change. And if they haven't started thinking about it already, it's going to be a huge issue for them.
Yeah, when customs makes this change, is it something where they're going to announce it in January and implement it, 4 years from now, or is it something that you're just going to see the Google alert that says, "Hey, de minimis is no longer a thing. You got to be compliant within 30 days."
So they will typically give you at least a year's notice, but there are customs and practices of, there's like habits and practices of what people do. In theory, I don't believe that there's anything to stop them from making an announcement, keeping it very under the radar, and then finding people who are not compliant. As a practical matter, customs doesn't want to completely gum up the flow of commerce. Their job is to keep things moving in an orderly manner. They have an incentive to continue to collect revenue, and you can't collect revenue if things aren't being imported. And they also don't want to they don't want to be so disruptive in their enforcement that it stops the flow of commerce. People get to be unhappy when they don't get their sweater on time. People don't like surprises.
Right.
Surprises are bad for supply chains. They're bad for profit margins. They're bad for customer satisfaction. My bet is that you will see at least 1 year's notice, and that enforcement may be phased in. Um, it probably depends on the type of enforcement and the efforts that people in a given industry are making to be compliant with things. But that there may be phased in enforcement.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think I read somewhere that it was like 60 or $70 billion a year that customs is not collecting because of the de minimis loophole and the threshold being as high as it is. So
Yeah.
that's a lot of money.
Nobody ever planned on like super cheap e-commerce. The practice of labeling things with UPS labels overseas, having them identified as belonging to an individual, rather than bringing things in bulk and then mailing them out from a U.S. based warehouse, is something they really hadn't counted on. It's a lot of money, and $65 billion will definitely mandate a lot of change.
That's true. Yeah, you could say, think of all the schools that we could build, or think of all the weapons we could build. It's just like the U.S. government's going to spend it on what they're going to do.
Yeah.
Um, I guess like what understanding that this is likely to happen at some point in the future. What strategies do companies need to be thinking about to minimize the financial risk associated with being non-compliant, whether it is something that they intentionally were doing or unintentionally were doing?
So the key to all this is planning, and is understanding before you enter into a market. Um, for example, we have one client who make a direct-to-consumer home product, and they came to us and they had 17 new markets they wanted to expand into. Right now, they're importing from China into the US, and they had a few one-offs into other countries. And they had an experienced supply chain director there who came to us and said, can you do a study? Can you help us track down what are the requirements for labeling? What are the requirements for duties? What are the requirements for testing for this item moving into different markets? And dealing with 17 countries, a lot of them were in the EU, but they had substantial demand into places like Egypt. They had substantial demand into the UAE. They had substantial demand into Switzerland, which has a lot of different labeling requirements. And so you have to figure out what the regulations are to the goods that you're importing. That's the first thing, is understand the different markets you're dealing with. Then deal with reputable customs brokers, and if need be, consult specialized attorneys who understand what the rules are and will advise you on what the requirements are for given goods, what the pitfalls are when importing. The attorneys have a wealth of knowledge, and attorneys have seen almost and are familiar with almost every single edge case and how that might apply to the goods that you're importing. And then the other thing, and what drove us to build software systems, is have good systems in place. Today, there are a number of systems out there that are even available to smaller companies to go and keep track of this whole process, so that you can, rather than having on staff a customs expert, you can have a lot of your compliance process driven by software that line level operators can deal with.
It's helpful. All that being said, things are changing pretty quickly, it sounds like. I live and breathe this space, and I had no idea they were phasing out de minimis until 15 minutes ago when we talked about it. What do you do, or what should other companies be doing to stay up to date with changes in regulations?
So the key thing is, if you have a good customs broker and there are substantial laws that are changing that impact the kind of goods you import, they will let you know. They will let you know what's going on. If you are a company that's large enough to have a relationship with a global trade attorney, they will also keep you updated on the commodities that are impacted and how rules are changing. If you think about, in the same way that if you have complex taxes, you're going to require more complex supervision of your personal income tax filing process. As your business, and this is in part just driven by the fact that just as the tax code is difficult for the average human to understand, customs code and the, call it rather, somewhat esoteric and specialized laws that govern the customs world are really something that fall within the domain of experts. And it's one of those, it's a cost that your business should have in, and it should be indexed to the amount of reliance that you have on imports. But yeah, I would say that a good customs broker who agree that they will send you of a regular process of updating their clients on the goods that they import, and an attorney or consultant specialized in the space can make sure that you stay on top of regulations and that you correctly interpret them. Because just getting an email, I know sometimes when I receive emails from customs, I often have to go back and check with somebody who's an expert in interpreting them, as they're just esoteric codes of law.
Yeah. Are there specific product categories that prone to have more frequent changes? I'm thinking like agricultural comes to mind. I can think about some instances where quotas change and what you can import, what you can't import. Do you have the right license? And so I'm wondering, if you had to kind of think about, hey, if you're importing paper towels, you're probably okay because that's not really going to change a whole lot. But if you're doing something that is in X category, you're probably going to see more changes. So it makes sense for you to incur that cost of having that expert in your corner sooner rather than later.
So some things, agricultural products, tend to be very surveilled. They tend to be watched a lot. A lot of this revolves around geopolitics. If you have goods that are contested, or if the nation into which you're importing happens to have a strategic manufacturing base in a given product, and there have been geopolitical shifts. This could be a war, it could be new trade treaties, it could be the change of an administration governmental administration in the country you're importing into. Those are situations where you'll see more rapid change in goods. As to specific goods where you'll see changes, quotas tend to vary. They tend to be set when people negotiate free trade agreements. So I would say that rather than thinking about specific goods, pay attention to the geopolitics that are impacting the goods you're importing. Right now, there's a lot of scrutiny being paid to palm oil because of the risk of forced labor in palm oil supply chains and deforestation in palm oil supply chains. As rules start to be brought in that impact deforestation in Europe, assume that there will be a lot of changes coming into importing anything that contains palm oil into the EU. And palm oil is one of those shockingly prominent ingredients. It seems like it's in everything.
Yeah.